go back to our conversation the two are having this morning with the Kenya Human Rights Commission Executive Director George Gekoro when it comes to the referendum. Gekoro, I beg your pardon, George Gekoro, who is the executive Kegoro, who is the executive director of the Kenya Human Rights Commission. And Mr. Kegoro, thank you so much for keeping it here on KTN News Center, even as we took a break just to bring Kenyans up to date with this story that is developing, the murder of Monica Kimani. Let's go back to a conversation, referendum. And I'd like us, first of all, to have a look at the several bids that have been called, that we've seen as a nation when it comes to referendum. First, we had three calls for a referendum. First, we had the NASA one by Raila Odinga, where they were collecting signatures, and of course the IEBC said some of the signatures were not genuine. Then we went to Gatundu South Member of Parliament Moses Kuria, who called for a referendum to push the reduction of the numbers of members of Parliament from the current number to 200, and of course also the merge of some counties. Then now we had Ekuru Aukot, Third Way Alliance, who was the presidential candidate of the Third Way Alliance, who also had requested to have the push for, who was also calling for the push for a referendum, and that was in April this year. So for Ekuru Aukot, he wanted the numbers of members of parliament reduced from the current number to 149, and of course he's been collecting signatures. Just to take you back, Moses Kuria managed to collect 300 signatures, and Ekuru Aukot is currently collecting signatures. This is not the first time we are having this call for a referendum. So kindly take us through the process of holding a referendum. I know first you have to collect a signature, IBC has to approve it, then it has also to go to the county governments, to the county assembly rather.
I think, Brenda, the mechanics of how the legal mechanics of a referendum is not the important question for the country at the moment. I think the important question for the country is there is no political consensus on what our problems are. That is why you've got different people deciding that the problem is this and not the other, and the solution is this and not the other. So Raila Odinga, through Okoa Kenya, decided at the time that he saw the problem in a particular way, and Moses Kuria saw the problem in a different particular way, and Third Way Alliance also see the problem in a particular way, and each one of them has got a solution that suits their view of the problem. I think the question is, do other people agree that that is a problem? And do other people agree that the solution as proposed satisfies their view of what the solution should be? If we can't cross that threshold, if we cross that threshold, and crossing that threshold requires leadership. People, whoever it is that feels that the country, the people in leadership in the country, and the people in leadership in the country begin with the president and begin with the leadership of Jubilee, but also there are important responsibilities for those in the opposition. They need to play in the country, they need to play in people, including ordinary people, into their view of the problem. So they need to have an extraordinary convening that then that demonstrates that this is a shared view of what the problem is for the country, and this is a shared view of what the solutions might be. It might be that after the convening, people don't view that a referendum is necessary to begin with, or the problems of the country do not implicate a referendum to begin with, or do not implicate the numbers of representatives that we have. And if that is what most people feel at that time, then the solutions will be matched to what people feel. So I feel that we are jumping very many steps forward in talking about what a referendum, how the referendum might, the actual mechanics of the referendum might be organized, when it isn't clear what the problem is, and there isn't agreement or consensus on what the problem is and what the solution might be.
So, Mr. Kegoro, from where you stand, is the IEBC in a position to hold a referendum owing to the fact, when it comes to the question of its membership, the number of commissioners who are in office right now, should the country decide that we're going for a referendum?
I think that's an important question, Brenda, and I'm glad you've asked it. Part of the problem for the country on the part of some people is that we've got a disgraced electoral commission. IEBC did not do particularly well in the last election, and the authority of the Supreme Court in annulling the first presidential election is the basis for that conclusion. The Supreme Court found that IEBC committed illegalities and irregularities in the manner that it conducted the first presidential election. And before committing those illegalities and irregularities, we've had a situation where an electoral official was killed, a murder that has never been explained or investigated. After that, we had the resignation of a member of the commission, Roslyn Akombe, following claims that she didn't feel that it was safe to work for the ABC at the time. These are extraordinary things to happen in a country. Soon after that, we have the election that is annulled, and after the annulment, we have the second election, which was boycotted by the opposition. And then we've had these three commissioners after that resigning from office, and now they've been seeking to go back to office. So the IEBC as an entity to conduct a referendum is disgraced, even if you don't go back to how they handled the previous attempt by the opposition to carry out a referendum. So we don't have a vehicle that is ready to preside over a referendum if it should be decided that that is what the country needs. So all these things lead to a conclusion that the country needs to come together in some way, and this requires leadership. The country needs to come together in some way and ask a number of questions. The first one being, what do most people think are the country's most pressing problems? Of those most pressing problems, that's the second question, which ones command priority in addressing? And the third question might be, how do we go about addressing those problems? And once the solutions are found, the solutions might be in a referendum, the solutions might be elsewhere, then the country can move in an agreed fashion towards addressing problems. And addressing problems is itself difficult.
So, Mr.
Even when people are agreed as to what...
Mr.
Yes, Brenda?
Mr. Kegoro, in short, as much as you're saying IEBC is not in a position to hold this referendum, should the country decide to go that direction, you're also saying that currently, as the economy stands, we're not even able to hold a referendum financially.
I mean, there are questions of cost, obviously, and one of the things that that is being responded to by those who are calling for a referendum is that we've got a cost. The cost of representation is too high, and that is one of the reasons why we might need to reduce the number of representatives. That's a reasonable argument to make, but I suspect there are counter arguments to that one, and the answer to whether or not that is the argument that should win would have to be the subject of discussion. But clearly there is also a question of cost, and the country is in financial stress. That has become very clear from the agitation around the VAT, the finance bill provisions regarding the level of VAT and the types of VAT provisions that should be contained in it. So that is definitely also an issue, whether or not the resources that are very scarce now should be spent decide on a referendum. That is part of what will be discussed by the country, whether or not it can afford the solutions that are indicated in relation to tackling the problems when these are identified.
Okay, okay. Now, so many people have weighed in on this referendum push debate. We've had Deputy President William talk about it, Amani National Congress leader Musalia Mudavadi, and also Moses Wetangula. So I'd like us to have a listen to what Amani National Congress leader Musalia Mudavadi had to say about this push for a referendum.
If you put a question on a referendum issue to a hungry person, I don't know whether that person will give you an objective response to the referendum question that you're putting across. That person will have become vulnerable. And we have seen that money plays a very dangerous role in this country. When money is unleashed, people cease to think. So if you subject the Kenyans to a referendum when they are at their most vulnerable situation, what result do you want to get out of that referendum?
All right, Mr. Kegoro, you've heard what NC party leader Musalia Mudavadi had to say. He's saying that this push for, or rather call for a referendum is coming at a time when Kenyans are at their vulnerable moment, so anything that's being put on the table, they'll actually accept.
That is a reasonable position to take. I mean, the country, people are in very, very great financial hardship. We had a very long drought last year, remember? And then it was followed by an extraordinary rain season that also destroyed crops and destroyed livelihoods. We've had taxes being raised because we've had extraordinary expenditure, some of it which has been stolen and pilfered through corruption and theft. So that is the overall situation. So if people came together in the fashion that I've been saying, they might decide that the most pressing need right now is to provide livelihoods rather than to discuss the question of representation. So if that is the decision that people make, that if that is the country that the decision the country makes for itself, that the best thing is to provide livelihoods for those that are falling through the bottom, then that might become the priority, and it might be decided that a referendum, even if it was needed, should be postponed. But Musalia Mudavadi definitely has got a point. People are financially vulnerable. If they're vulnerable, they're going to be preyed on by politicians, because politicians prey on people around choices that need to be made if politicians have a stake in those choices.
So what is the political interest in all this? Because Honorable Wetangula and Honorable Mudavadi are saying that probably this call for referendum is just for personal interest, to create some seats for some individuals. Is that political interest in all this? Because as much as they're talking about reducing the number of representation, because Kenyans feel they're overrepresented, there seems to be a bit of like some political interest also in all this.
That seems to be one of the motivations behind the referendum, and that's why I said at the beginning of the interview that there's not full disclosure. What is represented as the reason for calling for the referendum might not be the real reason. So people are being told we want to reduce the number of representatives, but that is not necessarily the real motivation. The real motivation might be to, once you open up the constitution through a referendum, then you give yourself an opportunity to also open up the manner of political representation at the top in terms of changing the nature of the executive and so on and so forth. And we had, for example, the NDC, that's the National Dialogue Conference that was held by the church-led, the faith-led entities 2 weeks ago. It arrived at a resolution that we need to change the executive in the country to increase representation. So there's a clear thread, a political thread running through the country that to achieve inclusion, You've got to increase the number of people who are representing the country as president, deputy president, maybe create a prime ministership, deputy prime minister, and so on and so forth. First of all, in principle, I don't agree with that argument that we need to increase the number of representatives at the top. But secondly, increasing the number of representatives at the top does not guarantee inclusion. What it does is it gives the people clamoring, the elites for the time being that are clamoring for seats, it gives them a seat at the table, but doesn't necessarily translate into representation or inclusion. So that might be one of the reasons, and I suspect that is the real reason hidden behind the call for the referendum, that the moment you have a referendum, you're going to increase the size of the executive and have more seats and have more accommodation for the elite, and then everybody gets a piece of the action, and they will be fine, and the country will move on. But that doesn't solve the country's problems. All right.
And you know, this morning on a Twitter poll, Mr. Kegorobid asked Kenyans whether they think the country is ready for a referendum. And I'd just like to sample two important feedbacks so that we get your mind on what you think Kenyans are saying. Because, of course, majority of them are saying, 63% of them are saying, yes, we need that referendum like yesterday to reduce the number of representation. 37% is saying, no, we really don't need the referendum. So, and one of them who's saying no is actually saying that it is not the referendum that needs to settle management of public funds and adhering to the current constitution. Baggage of old constitution is still being carried along. And then the last person here. Okay, so many of them. I'm just trying to pick up some of the people who are saying no to that. And another Paul Kamau says Kenya and Kenyans ever ready for anything. I don't know what you have to say about some of the feedback that we're getting, especially for Stephen, who's saying that it is not about public funds. It is about the spending, and it is about us going back to old constitution. Is that need for talking about the old constitution at this time?
I think all I can say is that the politicians are doing very well. They've succeeded once more in confusing the public. That can't be a good thing. It can't be a good thing that every time the public comes to an important problem-solving moment or comes to an important problem-solving opportunity, politicians successfully confuse them by obfuscating issues. And they obfuscate issues because they do not create an opportunity for reasoned arguments one way or the other. As has been adverted to since this conversation began, we've got important problems that the country is facing. We've emerged from a divisive election. We'll get into another election at some point, and all the fears about all the violence that usually happens during elections will return. We've had all these, we have important questions that are being raised about the size of representation. There are important questions being raised about whether or not we are being overrepresented. But we don't have an opportunity, a reasoned opportunity where those issues can be discussed and resolved in a manner that everyone thinks that the solution represents the public interest rather than the interests of the elites that are pushing for one position or the other. So why would it be on these questions, for example, that Duale and Ruto are completely agreed on one side or as to what the problem is and what the solution is, and on the other hand you've got Odinga and Orengo saying something else? You can't have that level of unanimity unless it is these things are being taken on the basis of interests rather than on the basis of what is good or bad for the country.
Okay. Thank you so much, Mr. George Kegoro, the Executive Director at the Kenya Human Rights Commission, just trying to paint for us a picture of what we need to expect during the calls, or during the push for the call for a referendum. Of course, there's been a lot of debate on that over the weekend, and of course, here at KTN News Center, we shall continue keeping tabs with that. And